Testing, 1, 2, 3.
You know, if I could dance, I would give a performance. Yes. Okay. I'll try. No?
Can you hear me now? Oh, you can hear me now. Good.
Can you hear me? Not yet? Yes. I hear an echo. Okay. All right. All right. We can start. This is, if you didn't know it, an interview with Dr. Donald Brugging. Do you have a middle initial?
J.
J. And that stands for?
J.
It's probably Jeremiah, and he doesn't want to let on. Okay, he is the Reverend Dr. James A. H. Cornell, Professor Emeritus of Historical Theology at Western Seminary. He also is a Van Raalte Senior Research Fellow, and I'm his colleague there, so I see him daily for coffee or just walking up and down here and there. And I don't know if you know his fantastic sense of humor. That doesn't always come out, but he catches on immediately in anything that's mildly funny, and then he just breaks out in laughter. Sometimes I think this can't be good for your health, you know. So anyway, we are having an interview with him today. This is a little bit surveying his life, like unrolling a very rich carpet. And I wonder if you know, those of you who know him rather well, know all the intricacies of the weaving of this carpet, which his life symbolizes. So first of all, you're a Wisconsinite. Could you say a little bit about your hometown, your church, you know, even jobs you had working in a canning factory or something like that?
Oh, I will. I
Okay.
will. Yeah.
All right. Go
Okay.
ahead.
Grew up in Cedar Grove, Wisconsin, population 907, a distinction which it held for 2 consecutive census. We're a very stable community. I could spend the whole hour telling you about Cedar Grove, but I'll try to be brief. I suppose the greatest influence in my life was the First Reformed Church of Cedar Grove. The Reverend John Den Ouden was, throughout my boyhood, my minister. He was a fine intellect and a very astute pastor. Long about the time I hit Darwin in grade school, this posed a problem with Genesis. And the Reverend Den Ouden probably had already spotted me as a rather arrogant little spoiled brat. I was an only child. He said, well, he was a creationist, but as long as I believed that God did it, that was enough. And that took all the wind out of my, sails, and I've lived happily with science ever since. The Church Herald also played. We once had a church periodical for the Reformed Church in America, and it was a cartoon that arrested my attention. Here was a gentleman with his arms around a pile of 9 potatoes, and there was one potato with a little sign on it that said, "For the Lord." I was immediately struck with the indignity of only one potato for the Lord, and then I realized that that was going to do to my meager allowance. But it held forth a lesson about tithing, which has struck me throughout my life.
It was not a small potato, was it?
Anyway, one of the things that Cedar Grove also taught me was the value of work. I was born just before the market crashed in 1929. The Depression years were rough years, and you tried to earn money wherever you can. And to make a very long story very short, during college, and these were the days where if you worked hard during the summer, you could go a long way for paying for your tuition. And I worked in the canning factory. In those days, there were no age requirements. This was World War II. And worked alongside of German prisoners and arrogant prisoners from Rommel's Afrika Korps, prisoners after the Battle of the Bulge who were just glad to be alive, and they were very old or very young. But my chief accomplishment at the Calumet Dutch Canning Factory, shagging boxes of peas or corn over my head and whatnot else, we had to check out for lunch and dinner. We were on a punch card, and my great achievement was 1 week when I put in 101 hours and 15 minutes and made it to church at 9 in the morning. Probably the high point in my piety. Okay, enough of Cedar Grove.
Oh, great. I think this is going to be a series. You know, not today won't be enough. We'll have 2 more after this, if I'm correct in this. Before you went to Central College, did you ever leave Wisconsin?
Yes. Yes, I had an aunt, my favorite aunt, who lived in Elgin, Illinois, which meant in those days everybody stayed with relatives, not with motels and fancy hotels and that sort of thing. And we would occasionally drive down to Aunt Esther's for a weekend. And one of my most vivid memories of outside of Cedar Grove was the Chicago World's Fair of 1933 and 1934. I was rather young at the time.
Yes.
But I remembered that despite the impression, my father sprung for a ticket for the Sky Ride. They had 2 500-foot towers, and at about 200 feet off the ground, they had cable cars that went back and forth over the lagoon. And he paid for my ride in the Sky Ride, 1934.
Wow.
So.
Well, wonderful. Well, you went to Central College, and I think people here would want to know, why not Hope College?
To be very honest, Hope College was too sophisticated for me, at least from what I knew of the people who went there. It seemed to me that Central College was a better fit, and besides, Central College had a very strong recruiter by the name of Gerrit Van Ruckel, who talked me out of the University of Wisconsin, and to, I don't know why I thought, well, be that as it may. Anyway, he got me to come to Central College, and that was an excellent school. At the time, it was only 500 students, but you don't need thousands of students and hundreds of faculty to get a good collegiate education. Principal among my teachers was Dr. Laura Naines. the terror of the campus academically. She would spring verbal tests on students and pinning you down by name and wanting you to know this, that, or the other thing. Well, I came out of high school where basically if you read the text and remembered what you're supposed to remember, that was enough. Dr. Laura Naines taught me how to think. In my first test under her tutelage, I wrote 18 pages of fast script and got a C. A little girl in class wrote 6 pages and got an A. Well, I figured I must be doing something wrong. Memory was not enough. You had to think. What was the point of what she had been saying over these many weeks? And then there were the term papers, 3 term papers a semester. And these were not little itty-bitty term papers, or at least mine weren't. I regularly hit close to 20 pages, double-space typed. C. I wasn't going to get any academic awards with C, so I went in to see what I was doing wrong. The answer was, point up your answers, Mr. Brugging. Point up your answers. What did that mean? It meant I had to think about why what I was saying was preferable to the other sources that I had quoted, which seemingly did not have equal value. Why did one volume have correct answers with the other questionable? And I learned to think and evaluate. Laura Naines was so good as an instructor that when I did my doctoral thesis of 300 pages, the external examiner who could have killed my academic career right there approved it without a single change. And that was due to Dr. Laura Naines. She was good.
Great story. Can you mention some of your central classmates, whom are all known to us here?
Yeah, I went to college determined to switch as soon as I can to a program that would lead me into the field of architecture. When I I had a cousin who was an architect about a decade older than I was, and who I looked up to, and I read architectural books when I was in high school. I was even given a drawing board and a T-square and everything else, and designed an auditorium that impressed the principal of the school. I was going to be an architect. In fact, one of the German prisoners was also an aspiring architect, a young man, and I let him read my architectural forums. And so we had a great friendship that I laid up with. But unfortunately, at Central College, or fortunately as the case may be, the Lord knows, I fell in with a group of sinister pre-seminarians. One was the name of John, I think it was something like Hesslink, and then there was another one, Gene, and I think his last name was Heidemann, And then there was Ed, who turned out to be Ed Mulder. And the list goes on. Aaron Kuskamp, yes, he was there too, and on it went. Had a whole coterie that were in the theology club, and at one time we were even studying with the local Jesuit from the little church, Catholic church in Pella. Yeah.
Great.
Enough said.
And they remained your friends.
They switched vocations on me, and my uncle Oliver, the Reverend Oliver Droppers, gave good advice when he said, "Don't become a minister if you can possibly help it."
Ah. Oh.
Yeah. When I was trying to decide what to do, that was his advice. Well, don't be a minister if you can help it. That was good. I found out that was very good advice.
Did you stay in one of those fancy dorms at Central College?
Those were the days when Central College had one dormitory for women, and it had a little cinder block dormitory where they put all the returning veterans from World War II. They wanted to keep those of us who were young and pure at heart away from those worldly veterans. And so they put us billeted with people in the community. And I was billeted in a house with a widow lady, an ancient woman of 80 years. I thought that was ancient then. I had a roommate, Jerry Stravers, and we were in one room, one bed, and in those days that was not considered scandalous. Anyway, Jerry was going to be married as soon as he got out of high school, and sometimes I found myself in the grip of a passionate man who was sleeping. Took care of that well enough, but those were the days in which we, yeah.
Great. While you were at Pella, you also ran into a woman you liked very much. Can you say a little bit about the courtship?
Yes. John Hesslink and Gene Heidemann and Mel de Vries all were billeted with Gert van Ruckel, the recruiter who had recruited me to, after a year of fending off the amorous Jerry Stravers, I went to Mr. Van Ruckel and said, "Sir, if you have room in your house, if any of the people graduate, and I could join them. I have friends, John Hesslink and Gene Heidemann. Could I stay at your house?" And he looked at me and said, "Well, I have to be very careful with who I take in. You know, I have a teenage daughter, and I can only have the best of students in my house." Well, Irma has persisted in claiming that he was just joking, but it didn't sound like that at the time. And I never did get to stay in her house. Not even after I married her, come to think of it.
Well, many of us can remember Irma. Was just a lovely
well,
woman.
Irma is probably due to the fact that I succeeded as a minister. At Fordham Manor, everybody loved Irma, not everybody loved me.
Ah, okay.
And Well, that's the way it is with ministers. Tough. If everybody loved you, you're an exception, and you may be. I mean, I see some real notables out in the audience, but I was a little too arrogant to be lovable at that time.
Well, I didn't put that into my notes here, that this was confession time at all. So, fine. So, when did you marry Irma? Was that after your time at Central? Was it at Western Seminary?
Yes. It was after my middle year, sophomore year at Western Seminary, after the second year, and before my final year, but after Irma graduated with her bachelor's degree from Central, that we were married on August 13th. Proof enough that there's no truth about the 13th being unlucky.
Yeah.
For me, it was very, very lucky.
Yes.
So,
Great. Was there any temptation on your part to go to New Brunswick Seminary rather than to Western?
yes. Yes, it was out east, that was a draw. But my minister at the time, who was the Reverend Ray Althoff, was very insistent that I go to Western. And he did a good sell job on all the notables at Western and the fine scholarship that I would encounter there. And he was the determining factor, I think, of my going to Western rather than New Brunswick.
Did you begin to emphasize church history already in your courses, for electives or whatever?
Well, Dr. Laura Naines, of course, had been a towering example of a great historian and a person who made history live and who made history have meaning. I'm trying to stay out of politics right now.
Oh, okay.
When I got to Western Seminary, Western was just at the cusp of really strong academic exchange. When Ray Althoff was writing about the scholarship of the seminary, he was talking about our former parishioner, Dr. Outerslice, or Dr. Lester Kuyper. He knew that there was a young theologian coming in, Gene Osterhaven from Princeton. But you also had a number of ministers who were known for their piety and who were put into the seminary because they would help keep students on a practical track, which wasn't all bad. In fact, it was probably better than having all academics in a seminary, none of whom have had the trial by fire of being actual pastors and having enough demands made on their time for 5 people and having to handle it all by themselves. I mean, these were the days when John Nowden, with a congregation of several hundred families, could call on every family personally once every 4 years. And that was besides a morning and an evening sermon, teaching catechism on Saturday, having a prayer meeting on Wednesday night, sitting in on the Christian Endeavor Center, the young people, after having preached 2 sermons and taught Sunday school on Sunday morning, and married and buried everybody that needed it.
Wow.
Yeah.
They're poor wives.
What?
They're poor wives. They probably never saw him. When you were at Western, when did you get the idea that you wanted to go for a PhD somewhere?
Almost immediately.
Oh. Okay.
Yeah. Laura Naines had put the the role of the professorate front and center. Dr. Outerslice, Dr. Kuiper, Dr. Osterhaven did the same. And I should remember John R. Mulder, our towering president, who in my days I was fortunate enough to be trained in homiletics by John R. Mulder. And he was a great homiletician. And I still think one of the reasons students tended to fear him was Dr. Mulder was a no-notes preacher. His first assignment in homiletics class was you wrote out your sermon or typed out your sermon word for word. Then you folded it up, put it in your pocket, and preached without notes. Only if you hit a mental block that wouldn't dissolve like you have now, could you pull out your manuscript and find out where you went next. That was the first trial. The second was that you had to know what you were going to say. That's harder than you think. Put the whole sermon, boil it down to one sentence. Tell the congregation right off what you're going to say, then do it. 1, 2, or 3 points as you wish, and when you get to the end, that's it. You've said it. And between those two admonitions, you can turn out some pretty good sermons. And you also know by Saturday night, when you can't remember how you get from point 1 to point B or point 2, that you really don't know what you're talking about. And that's easy to do. Yes, that's easy to do. You know that you don't know what you're talking about because you can't remember what comes next. And if you knew what you were talking about, you'd know what comes next. And you have to go back to the commentaries or to the Bible and reread it until it finally becomes clear. And if it never becomes clear, you just have to wing it. But fortunately, that didn't happen too often.
It really sounds like this was a wonderful training at Western Seminary
Yes,
for you.
yes,
Yeah.
yes.
But now we have to move to Edinburgh, where you decided to go for a PhD. Can you say a little bit about your time there? I've heard you talk about it with great fondness, so I'm sure you can share some of that.
Well, Edinburgh was one of several cold baths in my life that I got the unexpected. One reason I went to Edinburgh is because I figured it'll all be in English, and I'm a lousy linguist. I do not learn new languages easily. And that's a long story, but it's part of having a heart murmur when I was a kid and not doing second grade, but that's a different story, a long one. One thing Irma taught me is never avoid a good parenthesis if it's really worthwhile. I was about to get into another long parenthesis, so where was I? Oh, Edinburgh. First of all, it was a totally different type of education. I knew Bill Jellema, who'd recently graduated from Central. He and his wife were there. Bert Kreithoff, who was a fine minister from First Reformed Church, had gone there. Dr. Harold England, who was the infant terrible, who succeeded John R. Mulder, was there studying for his doctorate. So I knew there would be friends there. Okay, and Irma, faithfully followed along. Where were we going to live? We didn't know where we were going to live. I found out from Jill Chelema that the things you did is you went to Jenner's department store on Princess Street, and you went up and you asked for the realtor, and you went to the realtor, and you asked whether you explained your university and you needed a home for yourself and your wife, and they said, all right, here, go to this place. And I said, aren't you going to give me a few other places in case I don't like the one you've given me? And they said, no, you like this one. Well, the woman didn't seem like I was going to get anywhere arguing, so I thought, well, I can always come back. So Irma and I went to look at 17 Abercrombie Place. Now, 17 Abercrombie Place was a very nice location. It was in the new town of Edinburgh, which had been built in the 18th century. Abercrombie Place was in a gentle curve, right opposite the Queen Street Gardens. On the other side was Queen Street, and then was George Street, and then was Princess Street. So right downtown. And you could walk across uphill and then down to Princess Street, and then you looked up and there was New College Edinburgh on the other side of the Princess Street Gardens. Well, our apartment was down a half a story from the street. By the time you got to the kitchen and back, it was a full story over the alleyway behind, and you could see the garage and the chauffeur's domicile over the garage with the Mercedes in it. Mercedes 300, by the way. But anyhow, again, a digression. Well, on the plate outside of the door, a half floor up was Consulat te Nederlanden, the consulate of the Netherlands, with the Colonel Nicholas Christopher van der Ruyt as Consul General. And suit and vest and tie on a Saturday showed us the apartment. And in the apartment were 2 Herman Miller chairs, the kind that was once in the library here and which used before they started to remanufacture them was worth $600 on the auction market. But anyway, I learned that an architectural student had rented it just prior to us. And anyway, this was a living room, dining room. For heating, it had 2 little electrical coils. It had 2 bedrooms, which we really didn't need. And the Consul General said, well, if we wanted to, we could sublet to the first secretary, Ans. We only knew her as Ans. I forget her last name. But anyway, not only that, but he said, and I really need a second secretary as well, and your wife would do just fine. And Irma, who was very honest, said, sir, I'm not a secretary. I do not type all that well. And Colonel van der Ruyt said, oh, I'm sure you'll be fine. He said, salary is, I think £4 a month or a week or whatever. That's all a little hazy. But anyway, between rent subletting and Irma's salary, why, this was going to be wonderful because we had to live on Irma's salary. She taught for a year in Hamilton, and it was on her salary that we were in faith going across the pond to Edinburgh for a doctorate. Well, yeah, that worked out fine. that it was great. And enough about it. Oh, Edinburgh was a very different system for a doctorate. Everything depended upon the thesis. Nobody cared whether you went to class or not, probably because you didn't have to pay anything for going to class. I went to all of Tom Torrance's classes because he was the reigning theologian at the time, and that was great. But that was mornings, afternoon, and night. It was working on that thesis. And it was a struggle to get the thesis done before the money ran out. Praises be to Dr. Names and to Harold England, who came up with a small stipend for us so that we could travel the continent after the thesis was done. That was unsolicited, but some kind person from Zeeland, Michigan gave us $500, which enabled us to travel the continent for 4 or 5 or 6 weeks. It's a marvelous addition. Oh, well,
How long were you there in total in Edinburgh?
24 months.
Okay.
Yeah, and this was that 101 hours in the canning factory stood me in good stead.
Oh.
I usually went to sleep reading Karl Barth.
Oh.
That only took 2 pages or 3. But when you work until 11 o'clock or 12 o'clock, and then, it was hard going.
I'm going to have a little interlude in this chronological path through your life. And this has to do with your tastes.
With what?
With your tastes. You know, you are a lover of opera.
Oh.
You're a lover of fine
Oh,
things.
yes.
So how did that come about?
In Cedar Grove. Yes, I mean, Cedar Grove had a great opera house. I mean, just kidding. Had the village hall. Wasn't even the size of a basketball court. But no, I learned to love opera through Electrolux. We had an Electrolux vacuum cleaner, and my job on Saturdays was to vacuum. And while I was vacuuming, I had the radio on, and Milton Cross was telling the stories of the operas.
You must have turned that on really loud over the vacuum cleaner.
It was the most salacious stuff you could get in Cedar Grove.
Yeah.
Then I learned that there was music that went with the stories. And the music was pretty darn good, too. And so that's how I got to learn to love opera.
Okay.
At Central College, I saw some films, including The Red Shoes, with ballet in it. And when the Alexandra Danilova and her ballet company came to Des Moines, Iowa, I saw my first real live professional ballet company, and it was marvelous. And I've been, when I get back to New York, my priorities were always ballet, opera, or theater.
Yes.
And so that's how I got to love them.
Yeah, I remember that being on the History Commission with you, that you liked to schedule the meetings at the same time. There was something really good on in New York.
Elton Bruins always claimed that I became editor so that I could keep coming to New York once a year.
Well, there's probably some truth to that. So, you know, the really fine things in life, you have a taste for, a little highbrow taste. In terms of sports, you're not very interested in sports, but can you tell us a little bit about your prowess in swimming?
Oh, I have won 2 gold medals in swimming. Both took place immediately after I hit the age cutoff, and I was over it. So when I was 60, I won a gold medal because I was the only contestant. I won my second gold medal the same way when I was 65. It's wonders what you can do as a complete klutz if you're the only one competing.
But you should also tell what you accomplished when you're in Cancun.
Oh,
You
well, I
swim.
had my swimming up to 5/8 of a mile on a regular basis this year, and the last 2 days I managed to put in a mile.
And
Now
this
that
man
takes a
is-
long time.
He is 93 and he can do that, so that's just really amazing. The other thing, talking about sports, is that you, because you are not particularly athletic, but your son and your two granddaughters excel, and at the coffee time at the VRI, we often hear about the wonderful things they do. So maybe you can boast a little bit.
Well, they were both competitors in cross-country skiing, and both came in firsts and seconds. In fact, Althea, who's the younger of the two girls, came in second in, I think, 3 competitions, including one all age groups competition, which means that she was competing against adults as well as college students, and she came in second place. And this was just not at local meets in Marquette, but also in regional meets and downstate. So I'm very proud of the girls, and she was also she was a great soccer player as well, and she could run legs off the boys on her team. This was Althea, and great.
And they're bright students as well, so they're scholar athletes, I suppose you would call them. So after you were finished in Edinburgh, you actually went into the pastorate. You told me later that it would have been difficult to get a seminary position without having had the experience in a pastorate. So you come out of Edinburgh and you need a church.
Oh yes, in those days, you really didn't. Dr. Outerslice and Dr. Kuiper had also been pastors before. Everyone in the seminary had been a pastor before, except, no, even Gene Osterhaven, I think, had had a brief pastorate. And so the normal thing to do is you didn't go around trying to find a seminary position. You went into the pastorate, which I did. And I ended up, another long parenthesis, I ended up at Fordham Manor in the Bronx, a congregation that was over 280 years old when I was there. It spent its first 100 years with 10 years of a settled pastorate. It was in the Manor of Fordham, 5 square miles of the Bronx, which at one time was owned by the Collegiate Church in Manhattan. That's another long story. And that's where I got my real education. Thus far in my life, I had always been in homogeneous contexts. Cedar Grove was all Dutch, Pellow was all Dutch, Holland, Michigan was all Dutch. Edinburgh was all Scottish Presbyterians, and they're about the same except that they spend money more freely. The Bronx was American pluralism. It's just so wonderful to watch MSNBC, to see all of these non-Caucasian faces. Just the most wonderful potpourri of people. Well, that was the Bronx. The Fordham Manor at one time had been rural. That was in the 19th century, well, 18th and 19th century. 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. Then it became urban. it became Jewish. When I was there, 60% of the area was Jewish. The 6-story apartment building, or was it 8, next to the church, was populated by all Jewish people except for one family, the Vasses, who were members of the Fordham Manor Reformed Church. He came out of he was Hungarian, and his wife was Ukrainian. And his family was largely Jewish, but secular Jewish, and so he became Reformed too. 35% of the area was Roman Catholic. Protestants and pagans split the 5% that was left. It was good that I had a background of 101 hours in a week in the Cedar Grove canning factory, because it prepared me to work hard. And keeping a congregation there was hard. Cedar Grove, you could always count on people turning up, because they always turned up the week before. You couldn't count on that in Fordham Manor. But wonderful people, but so different. When a stranger came into Cedar Grove at First Reformed Church, people spent the first year looking them over and trying to decide whether or not they'd fit. At Fordham Manor, you just accepted everybody, and then you learned where they were, and you learned what wonderful Christians they were. For decades after I was in New York and then in Holland, I'd go home and meet my first cousins, and we'd shake hands. That's the way you did things in Cedar Grove until the new millennium. At Fordham Manor, I preached my first sermon, and as I was shaking hands at the door, there came a woman who I later learned was Miss Edith Baumker, and Edith Baumker flattened herself against me and said, "It's so great to have a minister again." Well, this was different. Nothing you could do at Cedar Grove would gather that sort of attention. I seemed to have a thing with the Baumkers, because I soon learned that the way you got into hospitals to call on your sick is you wear a clerical collar. And so when Bonnie, Edith's daughter, was married and had her first baby, I went to call on her in the hospital, because and when I got to Bonnie, I got the same treatment as I had. They were huggers. And so here I was in this Roman Catholic hospital with this lovely young blonde mother throwing her arms around the priest. Had loads of fun telling this story to Irma when I got home. And what did the Roman Catholic mothers think of their priest? Who knows? Anyway.
You were a little hesitant to mention the response of one person to your sermon.
Yes.
He didn't think it was quite appropriate for church.
I won't get the punchline. I won't do the punchline. We'll stop short of the punchline. But Paul Court. Paul Court had been elected as deacon, and he was a wonderful deacon because he went to the Home for the Blind, which was on the Grand Concourse just 2 blocks from the church. And he would take his boombox along, and Paul sang in the choir, and so with the boombox he would sing to the blind residents of the Home for the Blind. So he was a very faithful Christian, and listen to the sermons very carefully. And if it was if it was not such a hot sermon, you'd get a handshake. If it was a good sermon, you got a good sermon, pastor. And if he deemed it a really good sermon, it wasn't just simply good sermon, it was a damn good sermon, pastor. If it was a really humdinger, that's the one I can't repeat here. But wonderful Christians who would read their Bibles on the subway, Christians who would witness to their Jewish or Roman Catholic friends at work who were in trouble of one sort or another, or illness. When I was at seminary, I think one of my best things was my idea of teaching history where it happened. And in other words, what was dubbed the Western Christendom Travel Seminar. And we ended up with my group of 30 students from Western going overseas to study church history where it happened. And to make a long story short, at Rome we ended up with a Roman Catholic order of very progressive Dutch nuns, the Ladies of Bethany, who had undertaken as their mission of Rome helping Protestants. As they said, you don't need to help Roman Catholics in Rome. They know what's going on. They know what it all means. He said the people who really need help are the Protestants who don't have a clue as to what's going on here in Rome. And it was through the wonderful Christian witness of the Ladies of Bethany that I think I really got to not only know Jews and Roman Catholics, but to love Roman Catholics as fellow Christians, in many ways superior, and learn to respect Jews for the demands of the Old Testament upon their lives and on their faith. And with that,
I had wanted to turn, because they're
overtime.
Yes, we haven't even got you to Western Seminary yet, but
Or my
Yes.
prize
I will-
volume, which was reviewed in 29 publications and made the cover of 4 periodicals, or historical series, as
Yeah.
general editor of the historical series of the Reformed Church in America, 96 titles and over 100 volumes.
I don't need to ask you any questions, he's just rolling on.
I'm
these things I
sorry,
was gonna
I'm
ask you.
sorry, I'm
That's
sorry.
Okay. You were talking about your trip, and I was one of the beneficiaries of this wonderful convent in Rome on one of your tours. But I wonder about the people here who are sitting. How many have gone with Don on a trip? Raise your hand.
Whee!
Okay. Great. And you went to Rome. Can you say the countries that you did on the tours? I know you did. I made a note. You led 57 seminarian studies abroad.
Okay.
57. That's enormous.
And, and over 20 which were strictly for architects.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
that was another 20.
Yeah. Wow. It's just amazing. They've been very successful. You mentioned here the historical directory, which Sarah already said was called the Historical Directory. Every minister or missionary is in here. But this is part of the historical series, and that was Don was talking about 98, 99 in the historical series.
Oh, I don't know what number that is.
No, but I meant in terms of the total.
Oh, total, I think it was 96 titles.
96. One of them is also the one by Elton Bruins, which is, of course, the history
Number
of
26.
26. So, the Christ and Architecture is a really hefty volume, and that is out of print. And right, and
What?
this, the Christ and Architecture, and that is very expensive if you want to buy it now.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So our church has one in the library, and many of the books that of the historical series, and also that Don has written, is in the library. He is the editor of books at the VRI, the Van Raalte Institute, and he is pretty busy with that every day. This is one of his books on the Heidelberg Catechism, right?
That was, yeah, I was on the historical committee and got the job of editing Guilt, Grace, and Gratitude, so that when they decided to do a historical series, they said, well, you did such a nice job in that, you can be editor of this too. And that resulted
That's how
in
it
96
began.
volumes.
Yes. And this is a history about the Reformed Church in America, called By Grace Alone. That will be in the church library. Elaine told me that it was missing, and she received the copy, but it still has to be cataloged, so you have to wait. And then this one, many people are not familiar with this, and that is a festschrift that was written in his honor by a number of scholars who knew him, and they would write about their particular field of expertise. So that was quite an honor. We have maybe 1 minute for a question. Any of you, would like to make a comment on Don, or yes, Robin?
A couple weeks ago, I think Don said something. It's so nice to meet a fellow radical. So I want to know in what sense you're radical.
Oh. Could you hear her question? Okay, do it again.
A few weeks ago, Don said, hello, fellow radical, or something like that. And I said, I'd like to know in what way you are radical.
I didn't give it away with MSNBC. No, that's and I read the opinion page in the Holland Sentinel. In fact, I think I get the Holland Sentinel for its opinion page, but that's as close as I'll get. Sometimes I do manage to surprise people. Christ in Architecture dealt with responsible liturgy within contemporary architecture. And so many people had a sense of horror when they learned that this Johnny-come-lately at Western Seminary had been appointed to the building committee of Third Reformed Church when they were considering tearing it down. Much to, I think, almost everyone's surprise, the horror to some and gladness to others, I was solidly in the camp of maintaining and restoring this beautiful building on the grounds not only of its aesthetic appeal, but also its historical significance for the Reformed Church, especially in Holland. However, there are at least a half a dozen of us who claim responsibility for having been crucial to the preservation of this building. And I can only say that without the chairmanship of Dr. Tempest, it wouldn't have gone through. His stature within the congregation, his modesty and moderation gave credence and authenticity to the rest of us who wanted to preserve this building. And so when the bill comes due for revamping heating and cooling, you know who to blame.
Well, we're all very grateful for this facility, the sanctuary, and the buildings connected to us. It's very tastefully, beautifully done. And I can say the same, actually, for your response today in the interview. So thank you very much for consenting to do that, and do it again, because we're not done with you yet.
Thank you.